Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Doctor is In podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nadia Sabeh, president and founder of Dr. Greenhouse. Today's episode is part of our special series, What Plants Crave from Technology, where I'm interviewing technology providers, developers, and designers about the unique technological needs for growing crops indoors and in greenhouses. For today's episode, I continue my spotlight on greenhouses and greenhouse technology with my guest, Neil Mattson. Dr. Neil Mattson is a professor at Cornell University School of Integrative Plant Science, Horticulture Section. It's a mouthful. He's also the director of Cornell CEA program. His research focuses on the environmental factors and cultural practices that influence crop health and productivity for floriculture and horticultural crops. Dr. Neil is also co-academic principal investigator for GLASE, otherwise known as the Greenhouse Lighting and Systems Engineering Public-Private Consortium, and they support research and industry adoption of energy efficiency technologies and practices in controlled environment agriculture. Neil really speaks a language that is close to our heart here at Dr. Greenhouse. He covers the gamut of what influences crop productivity, and he has even dabbled in HVAC and climate management. Not so many academics and researchers are focused on. So I'm really excited, Neil. Thank you so much for joining me on the What Plants Crave podcast.
Thanks
for
having me, Nadia. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah. I told you before we got started, I have so much to cover with you. If we have to turn this into 2 episodes, I think that would be awesome. Or this will just be a really lengthy episode and we'll cut it into 2 or maybe 3
I love
episodes.
it. Right. We can keep talking forever and see where it goes. But I love it. There's so many things to handle, and your intro was great. I would say at my core, I'm a horticulturalist. So I like understanding how plants grow and respond to the environment. I'm kind of like the Lorax. I speak for the plants. But then with that realization that it's all part of an integrated whole. And so, everything has to be kind of optimized or thought about in terms of plant production.
Yeah, and I think a lot of growers, especially some of the more experienced growers, are learning that or have learned that, if you change one variable, you have to consider how it affects all the other variables. Absolutely. And I think one of the most recent examples of that is the switch over from high pressure sodium lamps or just HID lighting in general to LED lights. It changes the mindset. Everything you did before making that change in lighting, now you have to kind of rethink how it influences the plant, influences the other systems that you're using to control that plant.
Absolutely.
So we are gonna get into that. But first I want to start with the softball question. Ooh. Why? And maybe it's not, but it's the why. Why controlled environment agriculture and specifically greenhouses?
Yes. Why did I start studying that personally? Or why is
both?
Yeah.
Either way.
And why is this industry growing really quickly?
Maybe? Yeah.
So I grew up in a cold climate in northern Minnesota. And I grew up gardening, not commercially, but on my family's small cattle farm. And then when it was time to go to college, I ended up double majoring in biology and computer science, because computers were a big thing in the 90s and programming and stuff like that. And I think if you would have asked me right when I went to college what I wanted to do, I would have said something like environmental science or something like that. So then as I was approaching the end of my undergrad, I was like, I don't want to see myself sitting in front of a computer programming for 10 hours a day. Although I still still sit in front of a computer for 10 hours a day now. But I went back to my true love, which is horticulture. And then I was like, okay, how can I combine plant science or horticulture and computer science And I would say I didn't have all the answers at that time, but the path was slowly illuminated for me over time. So I found a master's advisor at the University of Minnesota in John Irwin, who was looking at plant responses to light. This was before we had LEDs, so we looked at photoperiod and light quantity and some with light spectrum by using different types of lights. And then he really wanted to implement all of the treatment areas with their own temperature and light sensors. And back then, connecting with Campbell data loggers, it was not easy to do for someone that didn't understand computer science. So I think he hired me as a grad student and had me work on
Awesome.
sensors and controls. And then when I was going on for my PhD, my path was further illuminated, and I found a professor at UC Davis in Heiner Leith who worked on mathematical modeling of greenhouse crops.
I didn't
So
realize Heiner was your PhD advisor.
he was, yeah, and
Huh.
he just retired a couple years ago now.
Yeah.
But yeah, he brought that kind of like mathematical modeling and how do crops grow. And he had a very robust and like mechanistic model for how rose plants grow in response to the environment. And then for my PhD work, I incorporated or I learned about how roses take up macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and how they redistribute them and store them and things like that, and incorporated that into his mathematical model. So then about 17 years ago, I applied for this position at Cornell, which was originally a floriculture position, which I studied floriculture crops for my master's and PhD, and was fortunate enough to get to the position. As I got established here, I started interacting really closely with the founders of the Cornell CEA group, Lou Albright and Bob Langhans. And of course, there's so many commonality. A crop is a crop in a greenhouse, and yet, yes, there are crop specific things. But if you're trying to optimize energy use or crop productivity or climate conditions in the greenhouse, you can do that for floriculture crops or vegetable crops. So then those two professors, Lou and Bob, were retiring, and it was right after the recession. So in 2008, universities weren't hiring new faculty. So it's like, okay, how can the CEA program continue? And so I was fortunate to take over this kind of well-respected program. And then over time, we do still study some floriculture crops, but increasingly study greenhouse vegetable crops. Okay, I guess that's my part of that answer. But then why are we seeing more focus on protected cultivation or greenhouse food production? And I think the answer to that has evolved over time. One of them is so why are we as an industry seeing more CEA production? And I think 15 years ago or 10 years ago, a lot of that was because of the locally grown food movement. There was kind of a realization that people wanted fresh local food year round. And I think nowadays, in the last 5 years, it's really become a climate change and agriculture resiliency play or realization. And so we want to be able to grow vegetables closer to population centers. And then there are sustainability aspects, and we can go all into the sustainability, and CEA has its pros and cons, but it does have many pros. And so we can be more water use efficient, and we know that water is becoming limiting in agriculture, for example. And then others have said this, like Bruce Bugby when you interviewed him, but I do think that lighting and LED lighting in particular has really increased our ability to grow crops year round in northern climates. So
Yeah.
some of the LEDs on the market now are about 4 times more energy efficient than old school magnetic ballast high pressure sodium lights from 30 years ago. So if we can get 4 times the light output per unit energy, that means it can be cost effective to grow in a greenhouse or sometimes in a warehouse farm as well.
Yeah, I wish that there would be more emphasis on water when it comes to CEA. When I did my PhD, a big piece of it was studying the water balance of the entire greenhouse production system, not
Great. Yeah,
just
yeah.
right, not
Not
just
just plant
irrigation.
use, but
but
cleaning,
evaporative
sanitation,
cooling,
temperature
exactly.
control. Yeah, yeah.
And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, like it's not as positive of a message in some ways, right? Like we're using a lot more water to cool a greenhouse, especially in a
Hmm.
semi-arid climate
Hmm.
where evaporative cooling does work really well because it's dry. But in general, right? I mean, there are more opportunities to conserve water, and if we're able to save water on the irrigation and find better management solutions for those evaporative cooling systems,
That's right. Yep.
then we can reduce the water balance of food production. And certainly in a warehouse, I think, there's a lot of emphasis on, vertical farms use so much
Hmm.
energy, but the opportunity to conserve water is huge. As long as
Yeah,
we're not,
yeah. And
right? I mean,
if
but we
we
have to
are
put the
actually following
systems in
best
place.
practices. Yeah.
Yes, which
Yeah. Hmm.
everyone says they want to do it, but very few people actually execute that concept. But
And
I
we're
do
getting
think,
more opportunities in like a greenhouse. We could move to semi-closed
sure.
greenhouses, capture that condensate, use infrared blocking, glazing in warmer climates and things like that. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think as
And there's
water
always
becomes,
that trade-off between energy and water though,
that's
right?
right,
Things that
that's
are
right.
energy
Yeah,
efficient tend to
yeah.
be water inefficient and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. And I do
Unfortunately.
think we know that we can be very water use efficient, but when water is cheap and abundant, we can
Mm,
be kind of sloppy growers. So it's like, okay, do I keep my hydroponic pond nutrient solution crop cycle after crop cycle, which means I have to pay very close attention to root disease management and water quality and so on, or do I just dump it out and start from scratch? And yeah.
exactly. Exactly. Um, it's a conversation I've had many times, and growers like the idea, the concept, investors like the idea, I think probably the agricultural community likes the idea, but it's hard to implement. It's more technology that you have to include in the design and in the build out
Hmm.
and to
Hmm.
maintain. It's more space that you need for those systems to collect and clean and, redistribute it, more controls, right? I mean, it's more of everything,
That's right.
but
Yeah, yeah.
at some point it would be nice to know like where the cost benefit, comes together where
Yeah, and that can change by location too. So
absolutely,
some places have
absolutely.
abundant water, and if I'm in New York and I have a gutter connected greenhouse and capture the rainfall that lands on that, I can that can be a significant amount of my
Wow.
crop's water
Yeah,
needs for the year. So
absolutely. So, I mean, since we talked, just introduce kind of the idea of warehouse farming or vertical farming. I know that Cornell has put out a publication or two, maybe a seminar or two about the carbon footprint of vertical farming and comparing that to greenhouses. And I just wanted to ask this in this way. Is there a scenario that you can imagine where vertical farming or indoor production can be profitable, can be sustainable, and compete with greenhouse production? Or is that just never going to happen?
yeah, yeah, I love that question. That's something that we try to keep thinking about. And from a Cornell perspective, that really started with my predecessor, Lou Albright, as he was originally looking at how much lighting energy it takes to keep a crop going in a warehouse farm versus a greenhouse. And I love some of his numbers from New York State. So if we were growing lettuce in a greenhouse in New York State, and giving it kind of an optimum amount of light with supplemental lighting every day of the year. So we would get 17 moles per meter square per day of light. Averaged over the year, 70% of the lettuce crop's light would come from the sun, and 30% would come from supplemental light or from electricity. So then if we move that into a warehouse farm, of course, that means 100% of the light has to come from electricity. Then, where we started adding on to this conversation, we then started doing whole system energy models, and that started with Lou Albright working with Dr. Cale Harbick, who's now a research engineer at the USDA ARS. And so he had a 2016 publication where he then looked at, okay, what is also the HVAC component of that energy use as well. And then we have revisited this over time. So we have a 2020 and a 2023 publication looking at greenhouse versus warehouse farm energy use. However, your questions were broader than that. So besides energy, then it should really be carbon emissions, and then also like sustainability, but also profitability. And so I think there's different parts of that question. It could be profitable to grow in a vertical farm, and then some metrics will be very sustainable, but some metrics might not yet be sustainable depending on the source of our energy, for example. And so what we could think of is that if a crop is valuable enough, like cannabis, for example, or it could be edible flowers or microgreens, it could already be profitable to grow it in an indoor vertical farm. We know that there's lots of advantages in terms of controlling the climate that the plants experience. So if it's all about quality control and reproducibility, that is much easier in a vertical farm versus a greenhouse. So profitability is one side of that equation. That said, sometimes with really sophisticated greenhouses with good climate control, and like if you can go in a Mediterranean climate and use evaporative cooling, like it's hard to beat a greenhouse. So depending on the climate, it's hard to beat a greenhouse, and you might actually have pretty good control in a greenhouse. But then if you have more challenging climates, the farther north you go or the farther south you go, you might need to be in a vertical farm to get the quality control that you need. So then sustainability, as we were talking about water, right? So we know that water use efficiency in a vertical farm can be much higher than an open greenhouse with evaporative cooling in the greenhouse. It could be easier to control pests and diseases and food safety organisms in a vertical farm versus a greenhouse. So all this leads me to traditionally then our main sticking point with vertical farms is their carbon emissions associated with climate control. So when we've modeled this for New York, looking at growing lettuce in New York City, it's about twice the carbon emissions in a indoor plant factory versus a greenhouse with supplemental lighting. However,
per square foot of growing area,
per kilogram of lettuce produced. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a nice metric, right? It's like proof is in the pudding, or yeah. However, that lots of assumptions go into that, which is kind of like status quo lighting. And I forget exactly what we used as our efficacy, but maybe 2 micromoles per joule. So not a great LED, but an okay LED. And then using the mix of energy that we get in the grid in New York State. And we have a decently cleaner grid than some other parts of the US because we have quite a bit of nuclear energy and some hydroelectric energy.
Yeah, the source of energy of power generation by region, by state, by municipality. Wow, it ranges a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my most recent colleague that has been doing our indoor farm or warehouse farm energy modeling is Michael Eaton, and he's a PhD student in systems engineering at Cornell. He has a 2023 paper in the Journal of Cleaner Production, and he looks at different scenarios and then the energy use, carbon emissions, and water use by different vertical farm scenarios. All for lettuce. And he found there could be a pathway toward decreasing energy use and carbon emissions by about half with pretty straightforward technology. So like one of them was just, okay, LEDs are now in the market where we can get 3 micromoles per joule versus our baseline was 2 micromoles per joule.
Okay.
And then that will also affect the heat balance or the need for air conditioning in a vertical farm as well. And then other technologies that he looked at were carbon dioxide enrichment. So if we can add CO2 to say 1,000 parts per million, our light target for lettuce can go down from 17 moles of light to like 12 or 13 moles of light.
To get the same production rate.
Yeah,
to get the same yield.
Kilogram yield.
As opposed to using it how I think most growers are using it, which is to boost yield beyond a baseline as opposed to maintaining a baseline, right?
Yep, and that really makes sense. Boosting yield really makes sense for fruiting crops
Mm,
or crops like cannabis, where you're harvesting a flower biomass, I guess. In the case of lettuce, at least for head lettuce, right, we have tip burn issues, which I know you've talked about in the past, and so we can't like if we push the crop too much, we'll just get tip burn. So for head lettuce, we could be like, well, let's produce the same amount, but use less light and more CO2 to produce the same
I
yield.
love that. I love that. Yeah, the CO2 balance is really tricky because I would also be curious to know if there's a scenario where we could actually make a vertical farm or any sort of CEA production carbon negative. Well,
Hmm.
maybe we start with
Hmm.
carbon neutral, but right, like
Yeah,
because the
theoretically, the
plants are
plants are.
sequestering CO2,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
And I don't
So,
know if that's plant dependent or if that's condition dependent or if we just need so much biomass to do it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it just takes money, right? The more money you can throw at the problem. So, I'm not sure if it's economically feasible, but certainly it's technologically feasible, right? We
Mm,
would build a plant factory that has the most energy efficient LEDs and HVAC systems and then maybe we co-locate it next to a power plant or
yeah.
so we could use waste heat to run absorption chillers. I'm not an engineer, so I don't
You're
recall
on the right
exactly
track.
how that
Yep, yeah.
technology works, but yeah, so we could use that waste heat to run the absorption chillers. We could then use the CO2 from the exhaust so that the CO2 that the plants are fixing, it's being recovered from the air. And then the energy we do need to run things, right? We could install a really large solar field and it would have to be very, very large. So maybe like wind energy or nuclear energy or something like that. But yes, I think from a technological standpoint, the pathway is certainly there. Yeah.
Um, so I'd like it if you talked a little bit about Glaze, and what its mission is, how many members you have, how long has Glaze been around? I feel like it's been
Yeah,
around
yeah.
for a
So
long
GLASE
time.
has been officially in existence since 2017.
Oh, that's
So we've
it?
been plugging along for like 7 years
Okay.
now. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And the glaze story is very interesting. So at Cornell, and especially including my predecessors, we've been blessed to get a lot of funding over the years from New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. And many states have their own energy efficiency programs. This is New York, so some bit of everybody's utility bill goes into a pot, and then they're tasked with improving energy efficiency statewide so that we can meet our state's clean energy and decarbonization goals. And so they can do everything from, let's replace our fluorescent bulbs in our house to LED bulbs, or let's install heat pumps in homes and things like that. So they've long seen the greenhouse industry or the CA industry in New York State as an important industry economically for the state, but also one that has traditionally used a lot of energy. And so they're looking at, okay, if New York State is going to meet their carbon neutrality goals, and I'll forget the exact, but maybe by 2040 or whatever that is, but we're seeing double-digit growth by the greenhouse vegetable industry in the state every year. Like those two things are at odds from each other. So we need to
Wow.
understand best practices and then really drive outreach of best practices. And then part of our charge was to not just make this a New York centric thing, but really like how could this be a model, or how can the research that we do reach the US or reach North America or reach the world. And so part of that, so we got a lot of seed funding from NYSERDA to conduct applied research, and then forming the GLASE consortium with industry support allowed us to put the infrastructure in place, like get an executive director. And our current executive director is Gretchen Schimmelfennig, who's wonderful, and get extension support. So how can we like translate this research and drive industry adoption? And so if we go back to like 2017, LEDs, for example, were a harder sell. I remember looking at a paper of Bruce Bugby's in 2014, And in 2014, the best LEDs only had the same efficacy as the best high pressure sodium lights.
Wow.
So in 2014, there was not really a return on investment for adopting LEDs. And then by 2017, there were some LEDs on the market, though expensive, that were about 40% better than the best high pressure sodium lights. And so I remember doing some of the initial calculations back then, and it showed that there was about a 10 to 12 year return on investment for adopting LEDs versus high pressure sodium lights. And it's like, well, that's a non-starter for
Yeah, yeah,
industry members. I'm sure they will look for like a 3 year return on investment or better than that with an energy efficiency
for sure.
adoption. So then we have a portfolio of research that is really a systems-wide research. And besides Cornell, we have colleagues at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which are in
Hmm.
the lighting-enabled and systems application lab. And so they're really LED engineers. They work also with like consumer lighting and designing smart conference rooms or boardrooms, for example, so that the lights turn on only when there's people in there. Or if people are only in half of the room, maybe we can dim the lights in the other half and so on. So using lighting and sensors and then being able to design very flexible systems. And what they did starting early on in the project is design really flexible 6-channel LED fixtures, and they designed them at kind of 3 different scales. So at kind of our smallest scale is measuring leaf level photosynthesis. And so you can clip on a photosynthesis meter to a leaf, and then with their LEDs, you can adjust the spectrum of light or the output of light, and then see what effect that has on photosynthesis. And then that's scaled up to a growth chamber, flexible lights, and then we also have greenhouse scale fixtures as well. So then we can look at the effect of light spectrum, light intensity, and the way that we control the light. And then we also in the project work closely with Dr. AJ Both at Rutgers University. And AJ has an integrating light sphere. He also has many other things and much knowledge to offer. So part of the project was also like understanding what is the efficacy of some of the fixtures that are coming out on the market.
Hmm.
How does dimming a fixture change the efficacy? And I think that's quite interesting, actually. So
Oh,
with
yeah.
LEDs, so with high pressure sodium lights, if you dim them, some are dimmable, but it is bad for energy efficacy. Like it takes more energy per unit of light output if you dim them.
Okay.
And LEDs are the opposite, actually. So if you dim them, you can get higher efficacy. You can get slightly more light output per unit energy.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and then some not surprising things, but important things that like AJ would have also shown us is that if so we know that temperature control of LEDs, like we don't want a light fixture to overheat.
Hmm.
So then you either need to have heat sinks, like a lot of aluminum to dissipate the heat, or you need like active ventilation with a fan. And so then like a LED with a passive heat sink is going to be more energy efficient than one with ventilation.
Sure.
However, you might have to invest more in aluminum, like you need a big hunk of metal to dissipate the heat. So there's some of those like CapEx kind of OpEx things. And then at
So,
Corn,
Neil,
yes,
can
this was
I need to ask a question, which has to do with that lighting efficacy on the LEDs. So, if it's more, and maybe I'm thinking about the energy balance a little wrong, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. If it's more efficient to run an LED at a dimmed rate at some percentage of, less than
hmm hmm
100%, would you use less energy if you bought an oversized LED and
yes,
then dimmed it to say
yes.
80%?
Yes. And some commercial LEDs are oversized without you knowing them. So it
Really?
might have, I don't know, 6,000 watts of LEDs, but the driver only goes up to 400 watts or something like that. And then you can dim it down from there.
Really?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And so what do they report? Do they report an efficacy based on 100% or based on that driver that's operating at
Right. So
that reduced rate?
that's always the question, right? So,
Is there a standard yet for
probably,
that?
I'm not sure if there is a standard, but maybe a best practice is you would report what your input or like how you operated that fixture. So if it's rated as a 400-watt fixture and you tested it at 400 watts, then you'd report that efficacy. Then, if you overdrive the fixture, so maybe the manufacturer is kind of telling you what 100% is, even if that's not the actual 100% or like how much you can actually drive that. So then overdriving it would be going like above the manufacturer's specifications, and then we might see lower efficacy as we overdrive that fixture.
So I'm sorry, did you say in your example that it could be a 6,000-watt fixture, but they're dimming it down
Oh,
to 400?
I was thinking 600 watt.
600.
So
Okay.
yeah. So closer to the same order
Okay. So
of
you're like at
magnitude. Yeah.
65%. You're at like
Yeah.
two-thirds.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
interesting. So they need to report the efficacy at the light intensity that's actually going to be delivered, not at
Yeah,
the
at the
rated
intended
fixture.
operation. Yeah, at the intended operation
Interesting.
amount. Yeah.
Uh,
And then of
I
course
had
you
no
can
idea.
right. And then I know things that you've thought about are of course different colors of LED diodes have different
Right.
efficacies. So like red is higher than blue, and then green. Apparently, physicists haven't figured out a very good way to make green LEDs, so they're
Hmm.
maybe a third of the efficacy of red. And so our like efficient way of getting green light is to use broad spectrum white LEDs, which are
Okay.
blue LEDs with a phosphor coating. Okay,
Got
so
it.
then continuing on with the glaze, at Cornell, our role then has been to test different lighting strategies and on actual crops, right, and their performance. And so some of the early studies were just like side by side comparisons with high pressure sodium lights versus red blue LEDs or white LEDs. And it's like, okay, if we deliver to the crop the same amount of light, do we actually get the same yield as high pressure sodium light, which is not always the case. It often is close to the case, but often it's not quite the same.
And that's kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask too. When it comes to greenhouses, I mean, the HPS versus LED in a warehouse, right? Like I can fully wrap my head around the benefits of that. But in a greenhouse, especially in cold climates, I still personally have uncertainties about whether LEDs are better for high pressure or than high pressure sodium in those northern climates. It am I thinking about that right? I mean, I guess I think about that there's, you can use that waste heat from a high pressure sodium lamp to reduce your
Yeah,
heating
yeah.
requirements
Uh-huh.
from maybe your gas-fired boilers or propane boilers or whatever. And so there's some extra benefit to using high pressure sodium or LED because it generates that less of that radiant heat. We
Yes,
need
that's right. Yeah.
other ways to heat the greenhouse or conserve the energy within the greenhouse. Can you talk about that a little bit and help me
Yeah, I
understand
think
that
so.
energy
There's
balance?
there's a lot to unpack there. But
Yeah.
we do know that HPS with lower efficacy give us more waste heat than LEDs. And then some of that waste heat is infrared radiation, which is like something like 840 nanometer wavelength radiation. That's not used for photosynthesis, but what it does is it's directed on the crop and it can warm up leaf surfaces. So it's a pretty efficient way to warm up leaf surfaces. And then the other waste heat could come from the ballast or the driver or so on. So that's not necessarily directed toward the crop, but going into the air in general, which is also where LED waste heat. So then LEDs don't have that infrared radiation that can warm leaf surfaces, but they have some of that waste heat connected to their drivers and so on, their power supply. So then getting back to your point, high pressure sodium fixtures can be beneficial in terms of we can take advantage of that waste heat in a cold climate, such as New York. And I remember Dr. Albright telling me once that a lettuce greenhouse with magnetic ballast high pressure sodium fixtures, so these old, not efficient high pressure sodium lights, they could provide about half of your heating needs in a lettuce greenhouse.
Wow.
So that could actually be an issue if an existing operation wanted to retrofit with LEDs, because their boiler could be
Oh,
undersized for LEDs.
sure.
Their boiler was designed for having all that waste heat from high pressure sodium light.
Interesting.
Um,
And then also, I mean, you would lose that sort of microclimate effect, right? Like there are some growers who are like, we want to create, right, this microclimate around the plant and we don't
yeah,
care as much. And
yeah.
so
And I
now all
think
of a
that's
sudden, yeah, delivering that heat to the plants is becomes more challenging if you don't just have it radiating down on top of them, right?
Yeah, and in a sense, I think that microclimate effect is the more important effect. So if we think of like the waste heat from high pressure sodium light, that's basically like using electricity to heat our greenhouse. And traditionally, that's not the cheapest way to heat a greenhouse, right? Like natural gas,
Ah,
is about half the cost as electricity for to heat.
sure.
Um, and maybe even less currently. We do get that waste heat from high pressure sodium lights, but the alternative to that would be a smaller amount of natural gas cost to heat up the air temperature. Um,
But
so,
now, as we move towards decarbonization efforts, and everyone's
mhm,
trying to go not everyone, but some people are trying to go electric. I know New York and California, our
mhm,
states are
mhm.
very similar in our decarbonization efforts. Now all of a sudden it seems like, wait a second, hold on a second. We just reduced the electricity for lighting and the power we need for lighting, which means we might need to boost our gas, right, inputs
Mhm,
for
mhm.
heating, but now we're working against our decarbonization efforts. So now do we go back to high pressure sodium lamps and use more power?
Right, right. I get your point there. So one thought could be let me back up for a second. When we've done some of our own studies where we've compared say baby leaf greens grown in a greenhouse with high pressure sodium lights versus LEDs. In this experiment, they were in the same greenhouse, so it had nominally the same air temperature, but then the plants under high pressure sodium light would have had about a 2 degree Fahrenheit warmer leaf surface temperature. And then we grew these baby leaf greens every month of the year. So we had another crop every month of the year, January through December. And what we found in that study is averaged over the course of the year, carefully applying the same total amount of light. So we have light sensors and 17 moles of light at each of the treatment areas. Averaged over the course of the year, we did not see a difference in crop biomass grown,
Okay.
which is a good thing, right? We hope that if we add the same amount of light, we can get the same amount of growth. However, in the winter months, we saw higher yield from high pressure sodium fixtures, which makes sense, right? That then that leaf surface temperature, the warmth, so we still have the same air temperature in the greenhouse, but our leaves are a couple degrees warmer. And with lettuce, leaf temperature affects leaf expansion rate. So we can get greater leaf surface area with slightly warmer leaves. And then in the shoulder season, like in the fall in our case, we can have a lot of like cloudy but warm, humid days. So we need to add supplemental light in the greenhouse. But kind of that extra leaf temperature is not desirable in that case for the leafy green. So in the shoulder months, we actually saw better performance of LEDs.
That is so interesting. Okay, but let me now, if I'm thinking about the economics, right,
Hmm,
of
hmm.
making this decision, do growers care more about being able to grow lettuce in the shoulder seasons or in the winter?
Yeah, so winter may be when things are the most limiting. Yeah. So summer, right, you have more light than you know what to do with. You can crank out the yields. Shoulder season might be okay, but then winter is when you really want to push yield if you can. Yeah.
Right, right.
So one thought, we haven't done these trials with leafy greens, but hybrid lighting. So having like checkerboard mix of high pressure
Oh,
sodium
yeah.
lights and LED lights, that might be a good option for a commercial greenhouse. And you can, in some sense, get the best of both worlds. So in the middle of winter, when you need the most light, you can turn on both your LEDs and your high pressure sodium lights and get some of that heat benefit or infrared radiation from high pressure sodium light. And then maybe in the shoulder season, you need some supplemental light, but you don't need all of your supplemental light. So you could just have the LED fixtures on, and then you don't have that additional infrared radiation that might be
Right.
unwanted at that time.
And you also probably don't need all of the wavelengths of light either, right? Because you're still getting some from the sun, from
Yes,
natural daylight.
right. Yeah. And then that said, there are LED diodes in the infrared spectrum. So I was talking with a horticultural lighting manufacturer recently that makes a really nice research grade LED fixture. And they're like, oh, we can custom design, different things that you want. And I'm like, I want diodes at 840 nanometer as well. And they're laughing at me because it's like it's not photosynthetically active light, but
Uh-huh.
it would allow us to either test these, like if we compare LEDs to high pressure sodium, we could turn on those infrared LEDs and warm up our leaf surface, but also
Right.
we could then separate out what is the visible light effects versus what's the infrared radiation effects. So that said, I don't have such a fixture yet, but if someone wants to build it for me, I would love to play around with it.
There you go. Call to action.
Right, call to action.
So, okay. So this leads me to my next question, which uh uh still has to do with glaze and lighting, which is can you describe the interrelationship between the glazing material on a greenhouse
Mhm.
and light and the need for supplemental light or infrared light? Like, how does glazing impact our lighting decisions?
Yes, glazing is huge, of course, as you know, but we'll describe for the listener. If you measure light outdoors and then you're like, okay, how much light actually gets inside a greenhouse, which is the transmissivity of the greenhouse, um, then glazing and then other overhead structural components are super important because we always feel we're doing pretty good if we get 50% transmissivity. So that means 50% of outdoor light actually gets into a greenhouse. And then the glazing itself is one part of that. And then the overhead structural components are the other parts that contribute to shading as well.
People never think
Um,
about that part.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because the
There's a
glazing
lot of
itself,
junk over the top of your
that's
crop.
right. Yeah. And then dust can also settle on the greenhouse and needs to be
Yeah.
washed off too. But as you know, like clear glass has something like 90% transmissivity. So only 10% of the light is shaded from getting in. And same thing with like a single layer of polyethylene. About 90% of the light goes through that. And so the glazing itself is one of the components, but then also those shading components. And that really was struck home to me. I had an experiment several years ago with Roberto Lopez. He was at Purdue University at the time, and we looked at finishing bedding plants in greenhouses versus high tunnels. And so we would take young plants, we would transplant them about April 1st or April 7th, and then move them to our university greenhouse environment to finish them, or to a high tunnel environment and hope they wouldn't freeze. It was an unheated high tunnel.
Okay.
And then look at finishing time, like days to first open flower, and biomass and things like that. And in that, we had light sensors both in the greenhouses and in the high tunnels, and no supplemental light because it was April and beyond. So we think, okay, we normally get quite a bit of sunlight. So what we found is in the greenhouse at Cornell, and probably Purdue's greenhouse was similar, We had about 50% light transmissivity in our glass greenhouse. They're research grade greenhouses, so they're pretty small sections and so on, but 50% light transmissivity. And then in the high tunnel, we're getting like 70 or 80% light transmissivity
Wow.
because it's a simple hoop house. There's not much overhead structure, and then a single layer of polyethylene.
Mm-hmm. And
And
not to
so,
mention, you mentioned in your research greenhouse that, that's on campus, that's academic, which means it doesn't just have enough of the structural framing to support the glass. It probably has
right.
more than that, right? To support the structure in case there was, I don't know, something happened while students were inside of it, right? Like
Yeah,
it has to
right.
be even more
If we get six
robust
feet of
because it's
snow and we weren't able to melt
right,
that down and there's students in the greenhouse, we sure hope it doesn't collapse. Yeah.
right, right.
Um and then that said, that can be that 50% transmissivity is pretty common with what we see in sort of, I don't, maybe not new greenhouse builds, but greenhouse builds from like 20 or 30 years ago.
Okay.
We'll go back and measure transmissivity. So
Even with glass?
even with glass, yeah. But
Why?
um, overhead structural components and dust and things like
Okay.
that. Shading. Um, yeah, maybe not 50%, but it's surprising how often you go into a greenhouse and there's much less light than there is
Than you
outdoors.
expect. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then a good greenhouse now is like 70% transmissivity. And that's pretty
Wow.
hard to hit. So then the glazing, of course we can have double layers of glazing, right, to save heat. So we can have double layers of polyethylene, and then that's going to reduce transmissivity by another 10%, or double glass, which is not very common, but maybe double polycarbonate, which is. But then there's the pros and cons of we could trap in more heat, but then we might need to add more supplemental light. So maybe it's not an easy question, but tends to be what we see in the industry is like a single layer of glazing is used for vegetable crops that have higher daily light integral requirements. And then for floriculture crops or maybe leafy greens, which have lower daily light integral requirements, we see double layer glazing in our northern climates, or like the
Sure,
northern
sure,
third
sure.
of the US. Yeah.
Would
Um,
you would you make a different recommendation for glazing material based on northern versus, I'll just say, southern climates?
Ooh, right, right. I may not know enough to make good
Okay, fair enough.
recommendations. I will say in our northern climate, snow load is definitely a
Oh yeah.
component. We do also think through like, okay, melting the snow load is one way to get rid of the snow load.
Yeah.
And then yeah, so also it depends on, like CapEx costs. Can we use glass or a more durable glazing, and amortize that cost over 30 years, or are we trying to get a return on investment in 5 years so that we have positive cash flow and things like that? So we might have to
Right.
use glazings that maybe they're not the best performing glazings, but they optimize the economics
Sure,
of that
sure.
build. Yeah.
And just to keep going with the conversation on the infrared long wave
Mm-hmm.
radiation and
Mm-hmm.
the benefits for plant growth there. Uh, Glass is basically opaque, right, to infrared
Mm-hmm.
radiation. So it would
Mm-hmm.
do a better job at trapping that heat in the
Mm-hmm.
winter in those cold
Mm-hmm.
climates where plastic not so much, right? Like it's basically
That's right.
transparent to
Yeah.
infrared.
And then you can get infrared coatings on plastic. So they try to trap the infrared.
Okay.
And then I know there's also newer glazings that have coatings that repel infrared. So if I'm in a southern greenhouse and I don't want
Oh.
that heat to come into the greenhouse, I
So
can
it's
deflect
basically
more of that
exterior versus
infrared.
interior surface
I
type
guess
of a
so.
thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the coatings work exactly, but yeah,
Yeah.
whether we're trying to trap it in a northern climate or trying to exclude it in a southern climate.
So
Um,
so would you say if you had an LED greenhouse that it would be a stronger recommendation to have a glazing that has that ability to trap infrared just to keep as much heat into the greenhouse as
Yeah,
possible, do you
if
think?
I'm building that greenhouse in New York, yes. So
Okay.
in that
Yep.
northern third of the US, and probably what I would try to do personally is I would use LEDs in the
You
greenhouse
would.
build. Yeah. And then
To hell with the heating. Like we'll find
yeah,
other
yeah,
ways to heat the
then
greenhouse.
right, then what I would try to do, because it's all about, you know, when we're heating, it's not about heating the air, right? It's
Mm.
about heating the crop. So then what I would try to do is underfloor heat,
Yes.
or in like tomato operations, they have the pipes that are also used as the rails for the scissors lifts. And so really they're providing heat kind of under the crop canopy, and then heat rises. And you can also get heating vents, right, that are kind of incorporated into the rows down the line of greenhouses.
Right.
So trying to provide that heat close to where the crop is, and then combine that with LEDs. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Creating that microclimate basically
Yeah,
around the
yeah. Uh-huh.
plant. Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So I'm curious, in your role as an extension specialist, what are some of the most common questions that you get from greenhouse growers and operators? And have they
Ooh.
changed over the years?
Yeah, right. I'll have to think about if they've changed over the years or not. But I will say the majority of the questions I get relate to disorders that are kind of happening in real time.
Okay.
So like pests and
Yeah, yeah,
diseases.
yeah.
And then I'm not an entomologist or a pathologist, and luckily Cornell has pretty good resources in those
Okay.
areas. But I have to pretend to know what I'm talking about. So I try to know the top 5 to 10 insect or
Sure.
disease pressures. So then an area which I love, which is abiotic disorder. So like nutrient
Mm-hmm.
deficiencies, nutrient disorders, other physiological disorders that could come from sometimes ethylene damaged from like a cracked radiator in a unit heater in a greenhouse, or someone that's
Mm.
adding CO2 exhaust or
Right.
CO2 from their exhaust in a greenhouse. And if the boiler's not working properly, there's ethylene. But yeah, and those nutrient deficiencies, things. So I would say probably, I don't know, because when people call me up, growers day to day, they're putting out fires, right? They're
Yeah.
like growing the crop, trying to be as productive as possible. So a lot of times the questions that I get on a day to day basis are those like putting out fire questions. They're not the like proactive, like, okay, I'm building a greenhouse a year from now. What lighting system should I use? I do get those, but those are on a longer time horizon.
Okay. Okay. So, you brought up ethylene. I'm so glad you did because not a lot of people understand that ethylene is damaging to crops, especially flowering and fruiting crops.
Hmm.
Could
Hmm.
could you describe what an ethylene disordered plant would look like? Like how would I identify that?
Yeah, right, right. So ethylene is a gas, and but not an enjoyable gas. And plants naturally produce ethylene internally as well. So it's a plant produced hormone. And ethylene is, what is it? C2H4. So two carbons connected together with 4 hydrogen atoms connected together. And then it is involved in a range of processes in the plant. And I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is this will show us that there's a range in different symptoms
Mm.
of ethylene damage. And so plants produce ethylene themselves when their fruits are ripening, or at least for many different kinds of fruits like bananas and apples and tomatoes, for example. Those are all climacteric plants. And so we could see like premature ripening, or senescence, like death of tissue with ethylene. In nature, you also see ethylene as a flooding response. So if you see plants growing in like soil and then that soil got flooded and there's a lack of oxygen in the roots, they will produce ethylene.
I didn't know
Um,
that. Huh.
yeah, yep, yep. And so one of the ethylene symptoms, which you will also see in these flooded plants, is called epinasty. And epinasty is where the leaves and stems bend downward. but they're not droopy. They're not like wilted. They're actually still turgid. So they have plenty of water, but they're bent downward. Um,
Why? Are they
and
trying to like grow away from the ethylene or something?
yeah, and I know we're not supposed to anthropomorphize plants. You've had some of those discussions before. But I think one of the reasons is if a plant, so if like roots don't have enough oxygen, the roots are not actively growing and then taking up sufficient water and nutrients for the plant. However, the plant's getting hit by solar radiation. And so the plant is trying to protect itself, or the leaves are trying to protect themselves, but from that direct
Oh,
sunlight.
interesting. Interesting. So it
Um,
seems like, I mean, if flooded roots that aren't well oxygenated in, say,
mhm,
soil or in the field, if
mhm.
you see that symptom of the leaves bending away from light, it seems very likely you could see that in hydroponic
Yes, right,
production.
right. Yeah. And then tomatoes are a good indicator. Well, it takes a long time for tomato plants to use up all the dissolved oxygen in the root zone. Um, and lettuce as well. Lettuce can get down pretty low. However, a great symptom of ethylene damage in a greenhouse is that epinasty, or those leaves bending down. So if I have a tomato greenhouse and there was an ethylene event, maybe from that cracked radiator, something like that, so the exhaust is getting into the greenhouse. Tomato is a great canary in the coal mine plant. It's very sensitive to ethylene. Um,
Interesting. And
so
you would see
less,
those leaves turn before you would see, say, flower senescence.
right. So you'd probably see some of those vegetative effects even before flower senescence.
Does
Um,
ethylene move well, or would you see those plants mostly close to that cracked radiator affected, or will it distribute through the
right,
greenhouse?
right. So gases diffuse relatively well, right, in air. But that said, you do typically see a pattern where closer to that broken heater, you would see more plants or more severe symptoms, and then farther away, where there's been like air venting through the greenhouse and stuff like that, farther away, you would see less symptomatic plants. Yeah. Yeah.
Got it. Got
And
it.
then other symptoms, which you were alluding to, are premature senescence of flowers. So the flowers will drop before they naturally should. Abortion of flowers, so like flowers that might fail to develop into fruit. You can also get leaf yellowing and browning. And also, when we've done this with like floriculture crops, some floriculture crops, maybe at like lower levels of ethylene, they'll just have like smaller flowers, or flowers that don't fully open as well.
So, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about efficiency because that is also part of GLASE's mission, and I think the mission.
Tune in with us in a few days to hear the rest of Neil Mattson's interview. Thank you for growing with us.